The studios did not just make westerns, they made masculine myths. They sold broad shoulders, hard stares, cowboy hats, and the promise of simple, fearless manhood. But behind that image, old Hollywood often hid private lives it believed the public must never see. In this list, the real drama is not just who these men may have loved. It is how the system policed image, desire, and survival. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there for you now. Ramon Novarro. Before later generations remembered the tragedy, Ramon Novarro was one of Hollywood's great silent-era idols. MGM sold him as a glamorous romantic star, exotic but still marketable, a masculine fantasy who could fill the space left by Rudolph Valentino. Ben-Hur made him enormous. Films like The Student Prince in Old Heidelberg and Mata Hari kept him visible beside major stars. But the image came with danger. Novarro was a Mexican-born leading man in a system already policing race, masculinity, and desirability. Studio publicity could celebrate his beauty, yet his private life had to stay locked away. Later, historians and queer Hollywood writers have described him as gay, or as a man whose relationships with men were an open secret in certain circles, but he never publicly confirmed any of that himself. That gap matters, because Hollywood wanted the fantasy, not the full person, and certainly not a vulnerable, private self that might complicate his marketable legend. As his peak years faded, the protection faded too. By the time of his death in 1968, the old star image no longer shielded him, and the story of his final years became entangled with the exposure the studios had spent decades avoiding. To audiences, he had once been a radiant screen lover. Behind that carefully lit image was a man whose privacy was guarded only as long as it remained profitable. George Maharis. In the early 1960s, Maharis looked built for stardom. He had the brooding face, the controlled toughness, and the restless charm that made Route 66 turn him into a serious television presence. Hollywood could market him as a modern leading man with just enough danger to feel exciting. He also recorded music, appeared in films, and for a moment looked like someone who could keep expanding beyond television. Then the danger moved off screen. Maharis's career momentum was hit hard after arrests tied to same-sex encounters. The language used at the time says almost everything about the era. Charges like lewd conduct and sexual perversion were not just legal problems. They were image poison. Even when cases were reduced or dismissed, the damage was already done. That is the part people forget. Exposure did not need a conviction to ruin a star. It only needed headlines, whispers, and executives deciding someone was suddenly too risky to protect. Maharis kept working in films and television, but the sense of major leading man ascent never fully recovered. His story is less about scandal than punishment. Hollywood liked his masculinity when it sold tickets. The moment rumor and law collided, that same system treated him as disposable. Randolph Scott. Few actors wore the Western mask more convincingly. Scott became the image of the stoic cowboy. Calm voice, rigid posture, moral certainty, and that granite-faced frontier authority that shaped films like Ride the High Country and a long string of Western leads. But behind the public image sits one of old Hollywood's most debated private stories. Scott lived closely and repeatedly with Cary Grant during their early Hollywood years, and their domestic arrangement sparked gossip almost immediately. Later biographers and journalists have returned to that relationship again and again, asking whether it was simply deep friendship, practical companionship, or something more intimate. The honest answer is that it remains debated, not proven. That uncertainty is exactly why his chapter has to be framed carefully. Scott never publicly identified himself as gay, and the surviving record does not allow simple certainty. What it does show is how intensely the culture watched masculinity. especially when a Western hero seemed too domestic, too private, too emotionally attached to another man, or simply too hard to categorize. So Scott's legacy sits in an unusual place. He remains one of the defining cowboy faces in American film. Yet his story also reminds us how quickly Hollywood turned closeness itself into suspicion. Anthony Perkins. Anthony Perkins is remembered first for Psycho, but before Norman Bates froze him into cultural history, he had already built a reputation playing anxious, sensitive young men in films like Friendly Persuasion, Fear Strikes Out, The Tin Star, and Desire Under the Elms. Even in Western-adjacent roles, he never projected blunt, cowboy swagger. His masculinity was more fragile, more inward, and that made him fascinating. It also made him vulnerable in old Hollywood. Later accounts, including Tab Hunter's memoir and subsequent reporting, describe Perkins as having relationships with men while remaining deeply fearful of what exposure could do to his career. He eventually married Barry Berenson in 1973, and the public image became easier to package. But the private conflict did not simply disappear. One of the saddest parts of his story is the repeated claim that he sought, or was pushed toward, conversion-oriented treatment in an effort to become straight. Whether remembered as psychotherapy, coercion, or self-punishment, the emotional message is the same. The system convinced too many people that honesty was a threat. Perkins's life was not a neat before and after revelation. It was a long negotiation between talent, fear, desire, and performance. On screen, he played haunted men. Off-screen, Hollywood, gossip, and fear gave him reasons to be one. Guy Madison. Guy Madison was sold as pure American reassurance. After wartime attention and a studio push from David O. Selznick, he became a clean-cut leading man and later the square-jawed star of The Adventures of Wild Bill Hickok. He looked wholesome enough to hang in a family living room beside the television. That was the brand. And brands had to be defended. Madison's private life has remained much murkier than Tab Hunter's or Anthony Perkins. He never publicly came out, and the evidence around his sexuality is far more rumor-driven than documented. Still, later writers and biographical retrospectives have described his sexuality as long debated inside Hollywood memory. That distinction matters. With Madison, the story is not certainty. It is protection. Studios knew how to market a handsome Western hero as all-American, available, and safe for female fans. Anything that complicated that image stayed outside the official story. So his chapter is really about silence as maintenance. Even when proof is thin, the whisper itself tells you something about the era. The cowboy image had to stay spotless, wholesome, and uncomplicated. The man behind it did not get the same freedom. Tab Hunter. Tab Hunter may be the clearest example on this list of a studio-manufactured dream colliding with private truth. Warner Brothers sold him as the blonde, all-American fantasy of the 1950s. He had battle cry, damn Yankees, magazine covers, hit records, and the kind of face designed for teenage bedroom walls. But the image was managed. Hunter later said the studio cared deeply about preserving the version of him that female fans could safely desire. Public romances were useful. Silence was useful. Even a mid-1950s tabloid scandal tied to a party attended by gay men did not destroy him, partly because the machine still believed he was worth protecting. The difference is that Hunter eventually told his own story. In his 2005 memoir, he confirmed that he was gay and wrote openly about relationships, including Anthony Perkins. That changes the emotional charge of his chapter. This is not only a story of hiding. It is also a story of reclaiming authorship after decades of performance. Hunter lets us see the whole mechanism, the fake ease, the smiling photographs, the strategic dates, the pressure to stay desirable by staying false. By speaking later in life, he exposed not himself, but the industry that had demanded the disguise for years. Forrest Tucker. Forrest Tucker projected size before he even spoke. He was towering, loud, broad-shouldered, and built for roles that leaned on swagger. Audiences knew him from films, stage work, and especially F Troop, where his booming presence reinforced the image of a confident heterosexual entertainer who seemed completely at home in his own macho skin. Publicly, that image was helped along by multiple marriages and a reputation as a ladies' man. Privately, though, later gossip histories and retrospective rumor have occasionally painted a more complicated picture, including suggestions of same-sex encounters or a private life less simple than the public brand implied. Here again, the documentation is thin, and the claims remain unconfirmed. So Tucker's chapter works best as a study in contradiction, not certainty. Old Hollywood often answered masculine anxiety with overstatement, noise, and an even bigger public performance. A towering, joke-telling tough guy was easier to sell than a complicated human being. What survives, then, is not a solved secret, but a revealing pattern. Even a man whose public image screamed confidence could still be surrounded by whispers that the studio era preferred to leave unresolved. Tyrone Power. Tyrone Power was one of 20th Century Fox's most polished golden boys, a matinee idol whose beauty seemed almost engineered for fantasy. He became famous through adventure and romance in films like The Mark of Zorro, Blood and Sand, and The Razor's Edge. On screen, he looked elegant, fearless, and perfectly composed. Off-screen, later biographies and Hollywood recollections have suggested a far less secure reality. Various accounts have claimed that Power had relationships with men as well as women, while his public marriages helped sustain the image the studio needed. Those claims were never publicly confirmed by Power himself, and they should stay in that category. Later accounts, not courtroom certainty. Still, even that careful wording tells a tragic story. A man this adored was living in an industry where even the suspicion of homosexuality could threaten reputation, contracts, and masculine credibility. In that world, charm became armor, and marriage could look less like romance than protection. Power died in 1958, still young, still luminous in public memory, and still partly hidden by the mythology built around him. That is why his story lands so hard. He was sold as the picture of romantic confidence. Later history suggests a man who may have spent part of his life afraid of what exposure would cost. Richard Cromwell. Richard Cromwell belongs to the side of Hollywood history where disappearance tells its own story. In the early sound era, he seemed promising, with visible roles in films like Tolerable David, Of Human Bondage, and Jezebel. He had the face of a sensitive leading man, but not the long-term security of a protected superstar. Today, he is often remembered through his brief 1945 marriage to Angela Lansbury. Later interviews and articles based on Lansbury's recollections have associated that marriage with the idea of a lavender marriage, or at least a deeply mismatched union shaped by secrecy. Lansbury later said she came to understand Cromwell was gay, and the two remained friends after the marriage ended. That detail changes the frame. This was Hollywood's survival, not gossip trivia. Cromwell eventually drifted away from the center of film stardom and reinvented himself outside acting. His story feels quieter than some others here, but the silence is the point. Not every hidden life ended in scandal. Some simply faded from the screen carrying truths the system had no place for. When you line these stories up, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Old Hollywood did not simply discover rugged masculinity. It manufactured it. It lit it, photographed it, wrote gossip around it, paired it with actresses, and defended it with silence. The Western hero was supposed to look simple, straight, fearless, dominant, available, and emotionally sealed. Real men were rarely that simple. Some of the figures here were openly gay only in retrospect. Some were never publicly confirmed at all. Some are still debated by biographers because the evidence is incomplete and the studio system was built to leave incomplete evidence behind. But even the uncertainty is part of the story. Confusion was not an accident. It was a survival tool. That is why the real villain in these chapters is not private sexuality. It is the machinery that treated truth as career poison. The cowboy myth promised freedom. For many stars, image made them less free. It turned romance into publicity, friendship into suspicion, marriage into cover, and silence into a job requirement. The hats, horses, and hard stares were real enough on screen. Off-screen, many of these men were living in a prison built out of branding. Classic Western heroes were sold as simple men. Their real lives were anything but simple. Which story changes the way you see old Hollywood masculinity the most, and why? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell for more untold stories.